Tonight, I wanted to share a rabbit hole that I've gone down recently. Don't worry, the whole thing's the rabbit hole. So, but I was kind of looking through, it's unfortunate that my email has auto subscribed to a few of the things that it has. They include things like Reddit and Quora and other like places where people go to question things. And a lot of questions come up around Christianity and the way things don't agree with one another in the Bible. And one of the most glaring spaces where the Bible appears to disagree with itself is a very long passage in two different books. If you look at the genealogy as it's set forth in Matthew versus Luke, Joseph was two completely different people, according to the way the genealogies are laid out. So to kind of get us started, I want to go through the first part of it. So this is where it matches up, because Abraham back is not included in one, and the genealogies generally match up all the way down to Jesse. After David, you start to see a difference in the way the genealogies are laid out. And there's some reasoning behind that, which I want to kind of explore tonight. What are the reasons that the genealogies are so different in Matthew and in Luke? So if you look through the history of this genealogy, it tells a story, and it starts in the Old Testament. So it starts with Adam, who was the first to deliver sin to the world. He and his wife Eve brought sin and death into the world. And as they brought it, they were given something in return. They were given a promise. So they were given a promise that is fulfilled at the end of this cycle we're going to cover tonight. So they were given a promise that through Eve, the entire world would be blessed. So we continue down through that, and we get to Seth. So the firstborn, which traditionally has been where this promise should pass through the generations, didn't go to the firstborn, because the firstborn murdered the secondborn. So Seth had to come into being to be a replacement for that firstborn. So that promise that was made to Adam was passed to Seth. And as we keep going, there's not much to note about the next several generations, but when you get to Enoch, you find somebody who's pretty special. You find somebody who was not only so good that he followed God, but he was so good that God took him with him. And you get to the next one, Methuselah, Enoch's son. And if you look at the math that is tied into how long Methuselah lived, being the longest living man recorded, he died in the flood. So his death coincides with the date of the flood. So more than likely, Methuselah was not good enough to survive what his son was able to survive, or what his grandson was able to survive. Eventually, we get to Noah. And in 1 Peter uses the flood as an example of what baptism is. So Noah becomes the example of the first time baptism into the world, where it was washed clean by water. Then we get to Shem. And Shem, through some failure of his father, was the one who received the blessing from Noah. So that promise that was given all the way back in the Garden of Eden was passed through Shem's line. And Shem's line is where we get a lot of the nations that we're going to be interacting with throughout the rest of the Bible. So the Jews all come from the Semitic line, but so do the Canaanites, so do the Philistines, so do all of these people that we're going to be interacting with. All of these people who quickly give up serving God and turn to idols. All of these people who worship things like Molech, where literally you are to offer your children to the bronze god that they set on fire so that your children burn to provide protection for your people. That you have human sacrifice, even of adults. and you have a people who have turned so far away from the will of God that they're almost unrecognizable. You have Canaan, who's significant only that he is not mentioned in some old Masoretic text, but was in the Septuagint. So when Luke is quoting this, he's quoting the passage from the Septuagint. And then you get Peleg. So Peleg is described as during his lifetime, the world was divided. This is when the Tower of Babel happens. I want you to look at how many generations are between Noah and Peleg. It's a small world still. So we're talking maybe tens of thousands of people, not the billions of people we think of as inhabiting the world today. It is a very small group of human beings that are on this earth. And you see, during Peleg's time, the world was divided because the languages were separated, and that caused a scattering of people. So they take all of their religious backgrounds. If you recall, what do they say at Babel when they start building a tower? What do they want to make? Something to reach God? A name for themselves. That is language that is used over and over and over in the whole Old Testament to describe man defying God. They're not taking on the image of God. They're not taking on the semblance of a godly people. They're trying to make a name for themselves. They're trying to take the power of God. God is the one who gives people a name. And you see that in the good examples. You see humility. You see people not lauding praises on themselves when they're given as good examples, but turning to God for salvation. You see it all throughout the Psalms of David, that David over and over and over is reminded that he should stop sinning and listen to God, that he should stop dwelling on his own problems and start meditating on the scriptures. So we see this come back over and over in the people that follow the God are the humble, and the people that follow themselves are evil. So we keep going through this. We finally get to Abraham. Abraham is an interesting man that by the time we read about him in the New Testament, he's called the what? The father of what? Father of what? He's called that too. He's called the father of the faithful. He's the father of failures in the way his story is recorded. Over and over and over through his journey, you see Abraham failing to depend on God and trying to take it into his own power to save himself, to save his family. You see it twice with Sarah, where he claims she's his sister, which she was his sister, but she was also his wife. So we see these failures accumulating through Abraham over and over and over. In fact, 9 are recorded, and he's finally successful with the last one, which frankly is the most horrific thing that we see in his life, and that he's told to sacrifice his son, only for his son to once again be saved by who? God. He turned it over and let God take care of the situation that he was creating himself. So we see Abraham taking his entire life to learn these lessons. And we see that mistakes pass through to the son. But one thing I want to note is in ancient rabbinical text, this guy we know of as Shem was still alive when Abraham was alive. He lived 100 years past Abraham's death. And a lot of these old rabbinical texts mention that was Melchizedek. That was the priest and king that they see one day, that Abraham sees and offers sacrifice to. It's his oldest living ancestor is who he's interacting with at this point. Now, that's not God, that's not the Bible, but that's old rabbinical text. But it's interesting to note that that is what the ancient Hebrews thought, in that it was Shem that is now known as Melchizedek, known by a priestly title. Then we get to Isaac, who once again we see loses the line of succession. It's a little less hard and firm in this one, in that Ishmael was born through who? Not his wife, right? Born through Hagar. But Isaac is the second born. By all accounts, according to the law at the time, Ishmael should have been one to receive the birthright, and that blessing should have passed through Ishmael. But that blessing was instead passed down to Isaac. Then we see Jacob, who is a second born and a liar and a thief. All throughout his life, we see him doing the wrong thing over and over till he finally comes back home. And he reaps terrible consequences for a lot of his actions. He ends up with 2 wives and 2 concubines because of this. He ends up with a multitude of children. And when he finally comes back home, he has to encounter God himself to start to change his life. He has to wrestle with God, a physical wrestling to represent all the wrestling he has been doing by living in his own devices and not turning it over to God. This is a lesson that humanity has always struggled to learn. And that's what we see in this collection of people who eventually lead us down to Jesus. We see a people who are struggling to accept God for who God is. We get to Judah. Not only does Jesus not pass it through the firstborn, but he doubles down this time. The firstborn doesn't get it. The secondborn doesn't get it. The thirdborn doesn't get it. Their sin drove the blessing away from them, and it's inherited by the fourthborn. So in Judah, we see the fourthborn receiving the blessing, and Judah was not a good person either. Judah slept with Tamar, who was his daughter-in-law, and the son who becomes the line that David comes through was a child of incest. It was a child that is born of Judah and his daughter-in-law. So we go a little further. We get to somebody who may or may not belong in the text. It's not in the Masoretic text, but it's in the Septuagint. And then we get down to Selah and Rahab. Was Rahab Jewish? No. Rahab bore Boaz. Boaz married who? Also not a Jew. So by the time you get to the person who's being set up to be king, the blood of the Jewish nation has been almost eliminated from his lineage. So you have Obed and Jesse, who probably married Jews. I don't know who they married, but the line of inheritance from Abraham has been dwindled as part of the process. So are you seeing a pattern in what we're doing here? What God is doing with these with genealogies generation? He's setting up the person who would eventually be king. That it's not a Jew. That it's not someone who is from a lineage of people who are pure and a people who are honorable. It's from a people that he created to love, knowing their faults, knowing how many times they would fail. So now we get to David. And at David's point in the text, there's 2 genealogies. They're completely different. In Luke, we have a genealogy. Make sure I'm right here. Luke, we have a genealogy through Nathan. And in Matthew, we have a genealogy through Solomon. And we look at those 2 things. That's 2 completely different lines. Which one of them was king? So the inheritance should have passed down through Solomon. The blessing should be passing down through Solomon. People would connect this idea of the blessing with a line of kings at this point because they're going to be descendants of David. But when we look at what we're given It's two completely different genealogies. They match up in one place in the future when you get to Shealtiel and Zerubbabel. Who was Zerubbabel? Do you remember? He's not mentioned a lot in the Bible. Yep. Shealtiel was born in captivity and remained a captive. Zerubbabel was the only royal line that came back. The only member of the royal line that came back. So if they were going to set up a new king, it should have been through Zerubbabel, right? It disappears. There's no interest in having a king anymore, likely because they weren't allowed to have one. But there doesn't seem to be any talk or any discussion around Zerubbabel inheriting the throne. It seems to be something that's gone away at this point. So why do we have two completely different lineages? Have you ever heard an explanation for this before? So when you look at it, there are three reasons that scholars give for it. So one of them is that they are both talking about Joseph's ancestry. And Joseph's ancestry was recorded two ways. So he was adopted by the descendant of Zerubbabel that is mentioned in Matthew. And so that's where he gets his legal lineage. But his biological lineage is what's traced in Luke. The other is that there is I'm trying to remember exactly what this one is. Oh, sorry, I said them backwards. So that's the physical. That's the problem with progressives. I can never tell on the screen where I am. The other one is that it was a lineage of Mary that is traced in Luke. And that the reason Joseph's name is used is because legally it would have to be Joseph to pass the inheritance along. But what it's saying in Luke's passage is that Luke does a lot of effort to document that Mary was a virgin. So as part of this, to make sure the lineage passed through, it's mentioned as supposedly of Joseph, implying that it's actually of Mary when it talks about it in the genealogy. Whereas over in Matthew, it is actually the lineage of Joseph. And the other one is that it was a Levirate marriage, so a lot closer to what we see with the daughters being passed from son to son up the chain if somebody dies. Realistically, of these three choices, there's a fourth choice I like a little better. Because it makes none of these three matter. And that choice ties back into what these genealogies are trying to tell us. So if you look at what the purpose of the two books are, if you look at Matthew's written to a Jewish community where the royal lineage would matter. So Matthew needs to tell the story of how he ties back from king to king to king all the way to David. Whereas Luke is written to Gentiles, and Gentiles are much more fascinated with biological means. They're much more traded in actual family, how father passes to son. If you think about the Roman Empire at this point, who is Caesar? Right, but which Caesar was it? It's Augustus Caesar. Was Augustus Caesar the biological son of Julius Caesar? He was adopted. You have a dynasty who crowns its descendants through adoption, not through actual biological genetics. So it's something that's different in the world now. It's something, if you look at the passing of the baton from I can't think of his name, Philip to Alexander, that was a father-son relationship. As soon as Alexander died, generals fought over the empire. The empire was split up into the Ptolemaics and the I can't think of them all right now, but it's split up amongst the different generals. So you're living in a world where the inheritance of your genetics don't matter the way they matter to the Jews, because power doesn't flow through manifest destiny, which is something we bring back later in the medieval era, right? It's something that flows through strength and through merit. So it's a much different audience that Luke is trying to target. He's trying to target everybody, not just the Jews. The direction, it goes forward. It starts with Abraham and goes all the way to Jesus. Whereas in Luke, it works backwards. So it starts with Jesus and goes all the way, not just to Abraham, not just to Adam, it goes all the way to God. So he, in Luke, is trying to show the divinity of Jesus, that this lineage goes all the way through history till God put the spark on the earth. If you look at the starting point, it's Abraham, father of the Jews, right? But it's traced all the way back to God in Luke. If you look at the core theme, Jesus is the foretold Messiah. He is the Messiah of prophecy. And if you look at Luke's theme, Jesus is the savior of all of humanity, not just the Jews. So when you look at who they're traced through, in Matthew, what the Jews would have been concerned about is how do you get back to Solomon, David's son? But in Luke, it's traced back to Nathan, Nathan's other son, or David's other son. Not the royal lineage, but the biological lineage. So when we look at it, what I want to take a little bit of a closer look at is why there's two stories. If we look back here, this one on the left side is the one through Nathan, and the one on the right side is the one through Solomon. How many names during those time periods do you recognize from Nathan's line? If you recognize any, it's the two that are highlighted in yellow. The one that was the king in exile, and the one that brought people back, because they're the only ones mentioned in the Bible. But on the other side, you have a line of kings that held the throne of David in Judah. So let's look at a few of these. You're going to see something similar when we look at this breakdown. Just like all the people on the first half of the genealogy, these were not good people. Both Solomon and Nathan were sons of Bathsheba. How did David end up with Bathsheba? Adultery and murder. There's probably no frame of a wedding that was described in the Bible that was more messed up than David's marriage to Bathsheba. So we look at both Solomon and Nathan descended through this terrible act where David didn't just steal his friend's wife, he murdered somebody who was one of his protectors. He paid for it with that one, but he doesn't appear to have paid for it long term. You get to Rehoboam. Rehoboam spent his reign punishing everyone else. He listened to his friends when they said, if Solomon taxed them with whips, you tax them with scorpions. He oppressed and tried to destroy the kingdom through incompetence, really. And he did destroy most of it. 10 of the tribes left during his reign. You have Abijah, who was a polygamist, married a bunch of women and kind of made it his job to collect a harem as large as he could. You have Asa, who generally was a good king, but when his health started failing, refused to turn back to God, refused to get rid of idols, refused to do the things that the prophet said, if you do these things, God will take care of you. Then you have Jehoshaphat, who started the ties back with the northern kingdom. Unfortunately, the king at the time was everybody's favorite collection of stories in the Bible, King Ahab the Evil. who was so abominable. When you get to 1 Kings chapter 21, after this king, not willing just to have an entire kingdom, listened to his wife when she dwelt on a vineyard, to the point where he took the vineyard from someone, and Elijah is sent to say him. So this is after idolatry, after the Baal worship, after the murder of all of his priests, after years of famine. This guy could not learn. And in verse 19, and thus you shall speak to him, saying, Thus saith the Lord, you have murdered and also taken possession, and you shall speak to him, saying, Thus says the Lord, in the place where the dogs lick up the blood of Naboth, and the dogs shall look up blood, even yours. And Ahab said to Elijah, Have you found me, O my enemy? And he answered, I have found you, because you have sold yourself to do evil in the sight of the Lord. Behold, I will bring an evil upon you, and will utterly sweep you away, and cut off from Ahab every male with bond, and both bond and free in Israel. And I shall make your house like the house of Jehoram, the son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha, the son of Ahijah, because of the provocation which you have provoked me to anger, and because you have made Israel sin. Ahab is told that his dynasty is going to be cut off, that every descendant of his will be destroyed. But in the meantime, Jehoshaphat, in his wisdom, had his son married to Ahab's daughter. And Ahab's daughter was a terrible person, just like her father. So she has Joram commit murder after murder for her. And then her son Ahaziah makes idolatry almost policy in Israel. And he lasts a year. Jehoash killed the prophets. And his reign was a little longer. But eventually, after Jehoash, there's a woman on the throne. The woman that was married to Joram. She takes the throne. She kills all of the potential heirs that aren't hers, and takes the throne for herself while her son is a regent. Eventually, Amaziah takes over the throne, and he's killed in battle, the last of the line of Athaliah. So at this point, Ahab's descendants are killed to the fourth generation, the same way it is referred to in Exodus and Deuteronomy, when the curse that God's deliver will be delivered to the third and fourth generations. The funny thing about these three kings, they're mentioned in Chronicles, they're mentioned in in the book of Kings. They are not mentioned in Matthew's genealogy, because Matthew agrees that they've been cut off from the line of succession. So the line of succession goes back up and goes to Uzziah. Uzziah took it upon himself to enter the Holy of Holies and offer sacrifice himself. Jotham allowed the idols to continue, had some religious reforms, but he allowed idolatry to continue in the country. Ahaz sacrificed his own children to Molech. Hezekiah, kind of a religious reformer, but his pride and vanity got the better of him when he decided to make a name for himself and go and fight Egypt. Manasseh finally sealed Judah's fate by adding witchcraft to their sins. So during his reign, the nation of Judah is sealed that they're going to be taken away. Ammon continued to worship idols. Josiah was repentant, but he was still prideful. Jehoiakim was one of the last straws. If you turn over to Jeremiah 36, Bible does not want to turn there. (36) and verse 30. Therefore, thus says the Lord concerning Jehoiakim, king of Judah, he shall have no one to sit on the throne of David, and his dead body shall be cast out to the heat of the day and the frost of the night. He was not only removed from the throne, but his lineage was removed from the throne, and he was cast out in a similar fashion, using words to describe how the scapegoat is cast out. So then finally in Jeconiah's day, the kingdom's ended. He's the king that's finally taken captive. We see Shealtiel, who lives a life in captivity. And then you see Zerubbabel, who actually brings them back. But other than that, there's nothing to note. And that nothing to note requires quotation marks under everybody else until you get down to Jacob, to Joseph, the husband of Mary. As mentioned in the lineage of Luke, that the other lineage could very well be the lineage of Mary. There's lots of explanations for that. But the important thing here is that it is showing that man was so bad at serving God, that man was so defiant, insistent on making names for themselves, that royal lineage was cut off, and it had to go all the way back to David to be reestablished through the line of Nathan. And that's the story. That's why we have these two different accounts, because one is an account of a royal lineage that is corrupt and void, and the other is an account of a royal lineage who did not make a name for themselves. They did not try to laud praises, to increase their wealth, to increase their strength, to make sure their names went down in history. It was a lineage of people who served God. And that's why we have those two lineages, because it shows us what God is looking for when he's looking for someone to deliver his son. So the legal line of Joseph was cut off, but the legal line of Mary, who was known to everybody to be a descendant of David, all the early scholars say Mary was a direct line descendant of David. But it was showing that God was providing a pure solution from people who followed him. So that's overall the lineage of Joseph and Mary and eventually Jesus. And in it, we see God using this filter of history. The same way we see it, that the nation of Israel was being filtered out and made improved. If you look back from Abraham, his entire life was learning to serve God. If you look at the Israelites, once the law of Moses was put in place, what's the first thing they did? They built a golden calf and worshiped it. Man has always been flawed, but God has always been trying to remove those flaws and make us his people, till eventually he set up not just this perfect line that Jesus was biologically going to come through, but he set up this world through people like Alexander the Great, who was amazing at conquering the world, who took Hellenic culture all the way to India, who primed the world to not just be able to trade with one another, but to speak the same language. The law of Rome wasn't written in Latin. It was written in Greek so that everybody could understand it, because that was the common language. Who used the nation of Rome when it was still a republic to build roads all over Europe and all over Africa and all over the Middle East, so that the word could be carried, so that encounters like Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch could happen on the road on his way home. God set up all of these things from the first man in the garden. And that's what Matthew and Luke are trying to show us, is that even though there was a line of people whose failure after failure after failure led to Jesus, God was always designer. He was always making sure that that path was there. And I think that's what having those two genealogies show us, is that God has a design and he's willing to let us in on it. But once again, most people just argue about it because they don't understand God's design. So that's it. Take a break and get ready for class, or get ready for songs.